My front door camera detected motion at 11:43 at night. 3 strangers were standing right on my porch, laughing and talking like they belonged there. One of them tried to open my garage door. I stood frozen in my dark living room, the glow of the screen reflecting against the glass, watching them through my phone like I was watching intruders step into my own dream. There was no sound of breaking glass, no screaming, just soft laughter, the clink of wine bottles, and one sentence that made my heart skip. Melissa said the gate code works for the whole block. Something cold slid down my spine. Sunridge Bluffs is where I moved 2 years ago, a gated community on the edge of Scottsdale, where people pay not just for a house, but for a sense of security. The electronic gate tower's 2 stories high, cameras run constantly, and each home has its own private access code. After a break-in at my old apartment, I promised myself I would never let anyone casually step into my life again. I am not a loud person. I am a cybersecurity engineer for a large financial company. I work remotely. I keep to myself. The people here only know me as the quiet neighbor who wears gray t-shirts and walks alone every morning. They do not know I spend my days building firewalls for systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They do not know I see vulnerabilities most people would never notice. But that night, the vulnerability was not online. It was standing right outside my door. I called community security. The guard hesitated before answering. They entered using a valid code. Sir. Valid. I looked back at the screen. A blonde woman laughed loudly and pulled out her phone to call someone. An SUV was parked just outside the side gate, engine still running. They were not sneaking around. They were not afraid. They acted like they had been invited. I knew exactly who to call. Melissa Harding, Vice President of the HOA Board. The woman who always talked about community spirit at every meeting. The same woman who looked me up and down the first time we met, gave a thin smile, and asked what I did that allowed me to stay home all day. Just computer stuff, she had said, stretching out the words as if that meant harmless. I did not respond right away. I kept watching. One of the men stepped closer to my front door and leaned in, peering inside as if searching for something. The hallway light caught his face, revealing the loose expression of someone slightly drunk. Something old rose in my chest. Not fear. Violation. I opened the gate management app. The access history appeared line by line. My code had been used 4 times in the past week, at hours when I had not invited anyone. I tightened my grip on my phone. The gate system issues a private code for each home. There is no shared master code, no blanket permission to distribute access. Unless someone on the board creates a temporary override. Melissa had once bragged that she could adjust access for special guests. Community spirit, she called it. Community spirit does not include handing out someone else's security code. Outside, the group began to leave. Maybe they realized no one was coming to the door. Maybe someone texted them back. When the SUV rolled out of the community, I was still standing there in the silent room, listening to my heartbeat slow and steady. Underestimating me was their first mistake. I did not step outside to confront them. I did not shout through the window. I opened my laptop and logged into an administrative layer of the system most residents did not even know existed. I am not an HOA administrator, but I understand the software architecture they use. I know it logs every change. I know it leaves a trail. I started downloading the data logs. In my mind, I heard the voice of an older neighbor who once told me that in HOA stories, everything begins with a small detail people ignore, an unanswered email, a temporary access override. Slowly, boundaries blur. That night, I saw my boundary being crossed. My phone buzzed. A message from security. The board says it was just a minor misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. I let out a quiet laugh. The sound was dry in the middle of my living room. While most of the residents here think I am just an introverted IT guy, they do not know my job is to find weaknesses before someone else exploits them. They do not know I can trace every change made inside that gate system. They do not know I can prove who granted access, and when. And if Melissa thinks she can turn my access code into invitations for her private parties, she has forgotten one thing. Security is not a slogan you hang in a meeting room. It is power. And tonight, I just discovered someone has been using my power as if it were her own. The next morning, I discovered that my code had been used 2 more times, at 2:12 in the morning and 3:07 in the morning. I had never granted access to anyone. Desert sunlight poured through the curtains, but inside my chest, there was only a dense, heavy darkness. I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and reopened the full access log. Each line of data appeared cold and clinical, like an indictment. Timestamps, entry points, authentication codes. Everything was marked valid in the system, valid to the point of perfection. Too perfect. I am not someone who suspects without reason, but I have worked in security long enough to understand that when something looks absolutely clean, it usually means someone has wiped it down very carefully. I called the gate management company. The woman on the other end answered in a steady, professional tone. When I asked who had the authority to create temporary guest codes, she hesitated for a brief second. The HOA board has that authority, sir. Especially the vice president in charge of security. Melissa. Her name cut across my thoughts like a scratch. I remembered the community meetings where she stood in front of the whiteboard, talking about transparency and responsibility. I remembered the way her eyes skimmed over me, as if I were just a harmless number on the resident list. If you are concerned about security, you can submit a formal request to the board, the woman added. A formal request. I ended the call, not because I did not want dialogue, but because I wanted to see the entire picture before stepping into the game. That afternoon, I walked over to my neighbors on the right, Daniel and Marissa. 6 months ago, their pickup truck had been opened during the night. Nothing major was taken, just a few tools and a power drill. The police said someone might have scanned a code remotely. Daniel opened the door with the familiar exhaustion of a young father. When I asked if they had noticed anything unusual lately, his eyes tightened slightly. Last week, someone was standing in front of my garage close to midnight, he said. I thought they had the wrong house. The wrong house. Marissa stepped out from behind him, holding their young son. She looked at me, her voice lower. We moved here because we thought it was safe. I understood that feeling. I had believed the same thing. On my way back, I looked at the neat row of houses under the pale blue sky. The tall iron gate stood firmly at the end of the street. The symbol of security for the entire neighborhood. A shell. That night, I reopened my security cameras. I fast-forwarded to the time frames when my code had been used. 10:20 in the evening on Friday. A black sedan passed through the gate. 20 minutes later, a red convertible. Both turned toward the far end of the community, where Melissa's house sits on a small hill. I zoomed in on the footage. A familiar face stepped out of the sedan. I had seen her at an outdoor party a few weeks earlier. Melissa's close friend. My heart beat harder, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. She was not just issuing codes for guests visiting her. She was using other residents' codes to let them into the community, leaving no direct trace tied to her own address. If anything happened, the system log would point to us. A perfect shield. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds. I listened to my breathing, slow and deep. Some people love power because they believe it makes them untouchable. They forget that every system has a weakness. I make my living by finding them. My phone buzzed. An email from Melissa sent to the entire neighborhood. We have received a few concerns regarding gate access. Please be assured that no security breach has occurred. No breach. I let out a quiet laugh. There was no humor in it. She was controlling the narrative before it had a chance to grow. In Karen's stories, people often assume the loudest person is the strongest. But real power does not live in a raised voice. It lives in data, in evidence, in the ability to prove the truth when others only have words. I went back into the system, deeper into the advanced administrative layer. That is where I found something even more interesting. Every time a board member creates a temporary code, the system records the device ID they used. It does not appear on the resident interface, only in the technical log. I stared at the string of characters on my screen. The same device ID, repeated multiple times, all of them matching the nights of parties at Melissa's house. She thought she was clever. She thought I was just an IT guy working from home, uninterested in community matters. She did not know that my job is not just writing code. I investigate vulnerabilities for banks that manage billions of dollars. I am paid to see through the most sophisticated layers of concealment. And now, I could see the entire blueprint. This was no longer about a few friends walking up to the wrong house. This was a pattern, a habit, a systematic abuse of authority. I did not send a rebuttal email. Not yet. I did not knock on her door. Not yet. I quietly saved everything. Because when you hold the evidence in your hands, you do not need to shout to prove you are right. You only need to wait for the right moment. And I knew that moment was coming. The Wednesday night HOA meeting began with a sentence that made the entire room fall silent. If anyone continues spreading false information about the security system, we will consider taking action according to the rules. Melissa said it while looking directly at me. The community room was flooded with fluorescent light. Folding chairs were lined up in rows. The air conditioner hummed overhead. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with cold coffee. I sat in the second row, hands resting lightly on my knees, back straight, silent. I had not sent any attack emails. I had simply replied to one resident in a discussion thread, stating that the system logs showed my personal code being used multiple times without my authorization. That was enough to make her feel threatened. Melissa wore a dark blue dress, her blonde hair softly curled, her smile carefully controlled. She spoke about community spirit, about trust, about not panicking over small technical misunderstandings. Technical misunderstandings. I listened to every word, feeling like I was watching a carefully staged performance. A few residents nodded automatically. Others exchanged glances. Daniel sat near the back of the room, arms crossed over his chest, his face tight. When it was time for resident comments, I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I spoke slowly. I would like to ask who has the authority to create temporary access codes using another resident's credentials. The air seemed to freeze. Several heads turned toward Melissa. She smiled, but the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. The board has the authority to grant guest access, she replied. It is our responsibility to ensure convenience. Convenience for whom? I kept that question to myself. I continued in an even tone. I have records showing that my code was used multiple times at hours when I did not grant access. I would like to understand the control process in place to prevent this from happening again. An older woman in the front row whispered to her friend. I have read many HOA stories, she said loud enough for a few people to hear. This sounds familiar. Melissa placed her hand on the table, her nails tapping lightly against the wood. If you are implying that the board is abusing its authority, you should be careful with your words. I looked straight at her. I am not implying anything. I am asking about the process. The answer did not come right away. Instead, she delivered a short speech about unity, about not doubting one another, about trusting those who volunteer to serve the community. I watched the faces in the room. Some believed her. Some were skeptical. Some just wanted to go home. Then Daniel stood up. Last week, someone was standing in front of my garage close to midnight, he said. If access codes are being shared freely, we have a right to be concerned. Murmurs spread across the room. Melissa tightened her grip on the folder in front of her. I saw a flash of irritation in her eyes. No one is sharing codes freely, she replied quickly. All access is controlled. I took a slow breath. Then, is the board willing to release the temporary code issuance logs for residents to review? The question landed like a heavy stone. For a fraction of a second, I saw hesitation. Just a fraction, but enough. That was when I understood. She did not expect me to know that much. She thought I was just a computer guy, unaware of governance procedures. She did not know I had consulted on security systems for corporations worth billions of dollars. She did not know I could read a log file the way others read a novel. We will review that request, Melissa said finally, her voice slightly less confident. The meeting ended in a heavy atmosphere. People stood up, chairs scraping against the floor. A few residents approached me. "Do you really work in IT?" a middle-aged man asked quietly. I nodded. He lowered his voice. "If you need more information, I am willing to help." When I stepped out into the parking lot, the night sky cast a deep purple hue over the neighborhood. The desert wind blew gently, carrying an unexpected chill. Melissa walked past me, then paused for a second. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said softly. I looked at her. The streetlight cast our shadows long across the ground. "No," I replied. "I am making it clearer." She walked away without another word. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to my own footsteps against the concrete. In my mind, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. She was not afraid because I spoke loudly. She was afraid because I had data. In the Karen stories people tell, the one who is underestimated is often the one who loses control in the end. But I was not losing control. I was controlling myself. And when you control yourself, you control the game. That night, I went home and opened my laptop again. If she wanted to talk about process, I was going to show her what a real process looks like. On Friday night, the community gate opened 11 times in less than 30 minutes. Every single entry was marked as valid. I was sitting in my home office, the desk lamp casting a pool of light over the wood surface, the screen reflecting in my eyes as the log entries kept updating in real time. 10:18 at night, 10:21, 10:24. The intervals were steady enough to raise suspicion. Melissa's party had begun. I did not need to check the cameras to know that, but I opened them anyway. Polished cars rolled through the gate, headlights sweeping across the stone walls. People were dressed well, carrying gift boxes and bottles of wine. They laughed. They spoke loudly. They entered the neighborhood as if they were walking into a 5-star hotel. None of them lived here. I zoomed in on the moment each vehicle passed the code reader. The system registered a specific resident code each time. Not Melissa's code. Someone else's. Mine. A household from the North Row. An elderly couple at the end of the street. She was not using just one code. She was rotating them. A pattern. I opened my analysis dashboard and began marking the dates. Nights with parties. Nights when personal codes were used at unusual frequency. The data curve rose on the screen like a heartbeat on a hospital monitor. Every weekend, that heartbeat spiked. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds, not from exhaustion, but from disappointment. I had once believed this was a one-time convenience abuse, but this was a habit, a shadow system operating under the banner of community. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Do you see this?" "There are a lot of cars coming in tonight." I replied briefly. "I am watching the logs." 3 minutes later, he called. His voice was tight. "If something happens, who is responsible?" The question hung between us. It was not just about a gate. It was about responsibility, about trust. I understood how he felt. I had been in that position before. The helplessness of knowing something is wrong but not knowing how to prove it. I knew how. After we hung up, I went deeper into the system. Most residents only see a simple interface. Beneath it lies a much more complex structure. I accessed the advanced technical records where device IDs are stored every time a board member logs in. The same device ID appeared in every instance where a temporary code was created. I ran that device string through an internal tool I often use for work. The result made me smile faintly. That device had not only logged into the gate system, it had accessed the HOA administrative network to edit meeting minutes, to remove lines of objection, to alter voting timestamps. Melissa was not just sharing codes. She was manipulating records. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the clarity unfolding layer by layer. I remembered the uneasy looks at the meeting. I remembered how she spoke about transparency. I remembered the warning tone when she mentioned spreading false information. False information. I stared at the evidence on my screen. Data does not lie. It simply waits for someone patient enough to read it. Outside, music from Melissa's house drifted through the night air, mixed with laughter. Warm yellow light spilled into the sky like a display of confidence. She believed she was in control. She believed no one cared enough to check. She was wrong. I did not send an email that night. I did not expose her immediately. I kept collecting, taking screenshots, saving copies, organizing everything chronologically. If I had to confront this, I would not speak from emotion. I would present a complete picture. Around 11:45 at night, an unfamiliar car stopped in front of Daniel's garage. His camera captured a man stepping out, looking around for a few seconds, then returning to the vehicle when he could not open the door. Invalid code. For the first time in weeks, an invalid code. I understood exactly what that meant. She was testing a different one. The blood in my veins ran hot, not with panic, but with resolve. This was no longer about parties. It was experimentation. It was checking which codes still worked. It was turning the entire neighborhood into a backup list for private gatherings. I stood up and stepped out onto my porch. The night wind brushed across my face, carrying the scent of dry grass and desert dust. I looked toward the brightly lit house on the hill. The music was still playing. The laughter was still loud. In many people's eyes, I was just the quiet neighbor. In hers, I was the one making things unnecessarily complicated. But inside the system, I was the only one seeing the entire picture. And when you see the picture, you are no longer its victim. You become the one who decides how it ends. Daniel's garage door rolled all the way open at 2:19 in the morning. No one inside his house was awake. I saw the moment on the camera footage he sent me, the grainy image trembling slightly under the pale yellow streetlight. The door slid upward slowly, as if an invisible hand were pulling it. Inside was complete darkness. No figure, no sound, only a chill spreading from that empty space. Daniel called me almost immediately, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We did not open it," he said. "I checked my phone. No one used the remote." I asked him to send me his gate access log. 5 minutes later, the data file was on my screen. A resident code had been entered at the side gate at 2:12 in the morning. That code belonged to an elderly couple who lived 3 rows away from Daniel. Not Daniel's, not mine. She was rotating the codes. I felt anger rising, but I kept it restrained by clarity. Anger makes people talk too much. I needed evidence to speak for me. The next morning, an email from Melissa went out to the entire neighborhood. "We have received a report regarding a garage door opening unexpectedly. However, there are no signs of unauthorized entry. It may be due to a technical malfunction from a personal device." Technical malfunction. I read that phrase again and again, like a bitter joke. Daniel sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone, the feeling of being dismissed written across his face. Marissa held their young son, her eyes red. They were not just afraid of losing property. They were afraid of losing control over their own home. That afternoon, I decided to send a response email. No attacks, no emotion, just data. I attached the sidegate log, the access timestamps, and an analysis showing the pattern of rotating resident codes on weekend nights. I ended with a single sentence. "This is not a personal device malfunction. This is an access management issue." The response came faster than I expected. Not from Melissa, from the HOA's attorney. The email was brief and cold. They requested that I stop spreading information that could cause unnecessary concern within the community. Any questions should be directed privately to the board. They also implied that accessing advanced log layers might violate the system's terms of use. I finished reading and leaned back in my chair. There it was, the counterattack. Melissa was no longer choosing public debate. She was choosing legal pressure. She thought I would back down at the sight of the word attorney. She thought the IT guy working from home did not have the resources to push back. She did not know one thing. In my home purchase contract, there is a clause requiring the HOA to ensure that the security system operates transparently and can be audited at a resident's request. I read it carefully on the first day I signed the papers. Occupational habit. I did not access anything illegally. I only used the resident privileges granted to me to review history related to my own code. I replied to the attorney's email in the same calm tone. I am not spreading concern. I am providing data, directly related to the access rights of my household. If the board believes transparency causes concern, we can further discuss the definition of that word. 15 minutes later, Daniel texted me. Did they send you a warning letter yet? I smiled faintly. They are trying. At the same time, a new email from Melissa appeared. Her tone was no longer gentle. She accused me of damaging the board's reputation and creating division within the community. She emphasized that any further actions would be subject to disciplinary measures under HOA regulations. Disciplinary measures. I read every word, the sound in my head, like a gavel striking wood. But instead of fear, I felt more certain than ever about where I stood. She was shifting from denial to intimidation. That is the move of someone who knows there is a problem. That night, I reopened all the data. Not just the gate logs, the edited meeting minutes I had discovered earlier as well. I assembled them into a complete timeline. Temporary code issuances, party nights, revisions to meeting records after residents raised concerns about lack of transparency. The picture became clear, not a mistake. A system of abuse covered by polished words. I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could continue sending emails, arguing back and forth until everything drowned in circular language. Or I could change the way the game was played. I looked out the window. The community gate stood tall under the night lights, a symbol of safety. Safety does not come from those who talk about it the most. Safety comes from those willing to protect it. And this time, I did not intend to just defend myself anymore. The official letter from the HOA's attorney was placed at my door at 9:15 in the morning. Inside was a warning written in language as cold as steel. I stood on my porch holding the envelope, the desert sun burning against my shoulders, yet inside I felt strangely calm. They had chosen to escalate. No more soft emails. No more appeals to community spirit. Now it was clauses, citations of regulations, threats of penalties for damaging the board's reputation. I walked inside, set the letter on the table, and read every line. They accused me of unauthorized access to advanced system layers. They claimed I could face legal liability if I continued distributing internal information. They emphasized that all authority to issue temporary codes fell within the board's jurisdiction. I exhaled quietly. Jurisdiction. I opened my laptop and pulled up my home purchase contract, along with the HOA bylaws. I had read them from the first day I moved in, not out of suspicion, but out of professional habit. Buried in the text was a small clause, one most people overlook. The board has the authority to manage the security system, but residents have the right to request an audit if there are signs of direct impact on their property. Daniel called as I was reading that exact line. They sent me a letter too, he said, his voice mixed with anger and worry. They said I was spreading rumors. Rumors. I looked at my screen where the numbers and timestamps still sat, cold and precise. I did not answer right away. In the background, I could hear his son laughing, a clear, innocent sound that made all of this feel even more absurd. A child living in a neighborhood advertised as safe, yet his garage door could open in the middle of the night because of a code his parents never issued. Daniel lowered his voice. I do not want trouble. But I do not want to live like this either. I understood. Everyone wants peace. An HOA exists on the promise of order, but when order turns into a tool of power, silence only makes it stronger. I told him one sentence. I will handle my part. After hanging up, I called an old contact, not my personal attorney, a security audit specialist I had worked with on a major banking project. He owed me a favor. I do not need you involved officially, I said. I just need you to confirm one thing. If a system allows an administrator to create access codes using another resident's identity without two-factor verification, would that be considered a serious security vulnerability? There was silence for a few seconds. If that were a banking system, we would raise a red flag immediately, he replied. I thanked him and ended the call. Melissa thought I was playing with fire. She thought I was just a neighbor trying to draw attention. She did not know that my daily work involves systems handling billions of dollars. She did not know that that I have presented reports in front of corporate boards of massive corporations. She saw only the simple exterior, and she underestimated me. That afternoon, I drafted a formal document, not to the entire community, directly to the board and their attorney. I cited the audit clause in the HOA regulations. I requested access to temporary code issuance logs for the past 30 days. I proposed a system review session with an independent third party to ensure transparency. I ended with a short sentence. If this request is denied, I will consider appropriate measures to protect my legal rights. No threats, no emotion, just options. That evening, Melissa stood at my front door. The knock was firm. When I opened it, her usual polite smile was gone. Her face was tense, her eyes sharp. "You are taking this too far," she said. "We are just trying to maintain flexibility for residents." "Flexibility does not mean using someone else's identity," I replied. She frowned. "You do not understand how the board operates." I looked directly into her eyes. "I understand very clearly how systems operate." A long silence followed. For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker in her expression. For the first time, I was not the one on defense. "Do you think you can take me down?" she asked, her voice lower. "I am not trying to take anyone down," I said slowly. "I just want the system to be as secure as it was advertised to be." She turned and walked away, her heels striking hard against the pavement. I closed the door and leaned back against the wall. This was no longer an exchange of emails. No longer back and forth in a meeting room. This was a line in the sand. Either I stepped back and accepted how things were run, or I stepped forward one more time. I looked toward the computer screen still glowing in my office. If they thought a lawyer's letter was enough to scare me, they were wrong. I am not afraid of conflict. I am simply choosing the moment to end it. On Saturday night, I personally disabled my own access code. At the same time, I closed the door that Melissa had quietly kept open for months. At 10 o'clock sharp, the neighborhood lights flickered on. From my office window, I watched warm yellow light spill across the stone pathways. The air felt still before a storm. I knew Melissa was hosting another party tonight. Polished cars would line up at the gate. Laughter would echo, as if this place were her private backyard. But tonight would be different. I logged into the resident management system using my own account. No intrusion, no overreach, just built-in features most people never touch. The option to change my personal code. The option to delete all temporary guest access. The option to activate two-factor authentication for every gate request connected to my code. I paused for a second. I was not doing this out of revenge. I was doing it for boundaries. I entered a new string of characters, longer, more complex, impossible to guess. I deleted every guest code that had ever existed. I enabled direct phone confirmation for any attempt to use credentials associated with my home. The system displayed a success notification. I was not finished. I opened the advanced settings available to residents with technical expertise. A feature few people knew about: automatic security reports for any unusual activity tied to a personal code sent directly to the homeowner's email. I activated it. Now, if anyone tried an old code, I would know immediately. 10:16 at night. The first alert came through. Access request using invalid code. I looked at the screen, not surprised, just confirmed. 2 minutes later, another request, then another. The pace accelerated. 10:20, 10:23. Cars were arriving at the gate. They entered the old codes, the ones that had worked smoothly for weeks, no longer valid. My phone vibrated. A call from an unknown number. I did not answer. 30 seconds later, a message from Daniel. "Is the gate stuck? I see cars lining up." I stepped onto my porch. In the distance, I could see red brake lights glowing at the main entrance. A few people stepped out of their vehicles, speaking to the guard. The guard checked the control panel and shook his head. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. "Melissa." I let it ring until it stopped. Right after that, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. "The gate system is experiencing a temporary malfunction. We are addressing the issue." A malfunction. I let out a quiet laugh. Not a malfunction. a boundary. At 10:32, my phone displayed a new access request. The system asked whether I approved a guest code. I looked at the screen. The name of the requester was clearly shown: Melissa Harding. She was attempting to generate a new code under another resident's identity. But because I had activated two-factor authentication for all access connected to my credentials, the system was forced to send the confirmation request directly to me. She could no longer use my code as a master key. I declined the request. 2 minutes later, another one appeared, this time under the elderly couple's code at the end of the street. I had spoken with them earlier that afternoon. They had agreed to change their code and enable two-factor authentication as well. That request was denied too. I imagined the scene at the gate. Melissa standing there with her phone in hand, her polite smile gone. Guests growing impatient. Car horns, whispered complaints. Her power depended on silence and ignorance. Tonight, both were gone. At 10:45, I received messages from other residents asking what was happening. I replied briefly, "Some personal codes have been updated to enhance security. If you have not changed yours, I recommend doing so." No accusations, no names, just advice. The response spread faster than I expected. Within an hour, at least 5 other households messaged me for instructions on enabling two-factor authentication. I sat at my desk, guiding each of them step by step. On the other side of the neighborhood, the party likely started much later than planned, or perhaps not at all. At 11:10, my phone vibrated again. A message from Melissa. "What do you think you are doing?" I read the words and could feel the loss of control beneath each character. I replied with one sentence: "I am protecting my code. Nothing more, nothing less." I set my phone down and stepped outside once again. The night air felt cooler than usual. The neighborhood gradually grew quiet. The brake lights at the gate had disappeared. Cars were leaving. I did not feel victory. I felt balance. She once thought I was an outsider, the quiet neighbor who did not understand how the board operated. But I understand systems. And tonight, I changed the rules of the game without raising my voice once. The next morning, Melissa was locked out of her own gated community, and for the first time, she had to call the security guard like an uninvited guest. I received the notification at 7:12 in the morning. An access request from a secondary admin code had been denied due to missing additional authentication. The new system that many residents had activated the night before was already doing its job. Any code tied to a personal identity now required direct confirmation. I opened the main gate camera. Melissa stood there, sunglasses covering half her face but unable to hide the tension in the way she folded her arms. A white SUV was parked behind her. A few residents out for their morning walk slowed down, watching the scene with open curiosity. The guard said something to her through the narrow gap in the window. I could not hear it, but I saw her lips press into a thin line. She had walked through that gate hundreds of times with the posture of someone in control. Today, she had to wait. My phone vibrated. A message from another resident. "What is going on with the gate? I heard Melissa cannot get in. Rumors travel faster than data." I replied calmly. "Some new security settings require additional confirmation. If you're having trouble, I can walk you through it." I did not mention her name. I did not need to. 10 minutes later, an email from the board was sent to the entire community. "The system has experienced an unauthorized update causing access disruption. We are working to restore it." Unauthorized. I read that word and felt a sharp edge of irony. Nothing I had done was unauthorized. I had simply exercised my right as a resident to protect my personal access code. But she needed a narrative. And in that narrative, I had to be the troublemaker. My phone rang. This time, I answered. Melissa's voice no longer carried the polished control she used in meetings. "You interfered with the shared system," she said quickly, her breathing uneven. "You had no right to do that." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window where morning sunlight spilled across the front yard. I only changed my code and enabled authentication for my home. And I showed others how to do the same if they wanted. "You know very well your actions kept my guests from entering," she shot back. "Your guests were using my code," I replied slowly. That is the real issue. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear passing cars through her phone. She was probably still standing outside the gate. "You are crossing a line," she said, her voice lowering. "The board can penalize you." I looked at the screen where authentication notifications continued to appear in steady intervals. "I am not crossing a line. I am redrawing it." She hung up. About an hour later, I received notice of an emergency board meeting scheduled for that evening. The message was brief. Discussion regarding conduct that disrupted the security system. I knew they would try to make me the center of the problem. But this time, I would not walk into that room with questions. I would walk in with complete data. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by my house. His face looked different from previous days. The vague anxiety was gone. In its place was resolve. "Marissa said she slept better last night," he told me. For the first time in weeks. That sentence made me pause. Not because I needed gratitude, but because it reminded me why this had started. We were not fighting over ego. We were fighting for the feeling of safety inside our own homes. When I walked into the meeting room that evening, many eyes no longer saw me as a troublemaker. They looked at me as someone who had voiced what they had felt but could not articulate. Melissa sat at the head of the table, composed on the outside, dark circles under her eyes. She began with familiar accusations. A resident had unilaterally altered configurations, causing disruption. I waited until she finished. Then I stood. I did not argue. I opened my laptop and projected the full log sequence onto the large screen. Timestamps, resident codes that had been used, device IDs that generated temporary codes, the timeline of edited meeting minutes. The room fell silent. I spoke slowly, clearly. I did not interfere with the shared system. I only protected my own access. If that exposed vulnerabilities, then the problem does not lie with me. Another board member turned toward Melissa, confusion in his eyes. "Where did you get this data?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "From the system we are managing," I replied. The air shifted. I could see it in the way people sat straighter, in the way the questions began to turn toward her instead of me. The plot twist was not that I changed a code. The plot twist was that they realized the man they thought only sat quietly behind a screen understood the system better than anyone else in that room. And when the truth was projected onto the big screen, power built on words alone began to crack. The meeting that night did not end with an apology. It ended with a vote. As the final log entries appeared on the screen, the room sank into a silence heavy as stone. No more whispers. No more chairs scraping. Only eyes locking onto one another. Melissa stood up too quickly, her chair sliding sharply across the floor. "This data is being misinterpreted," she said, her voice higher than usual. "The creation of temporary codes was meant to support community activities, support the community by using other residents' identities without informing them. This time, it was not me who asked. It was Mr. Harrison, a long-serving board member who had rarely spoken against her before. His voice was slow, but it carried weight. Melissa turned to him, irritation flashing in her eyes. "We all know the system has technical limitations. I was simply being flexible within the allowed scope." I looked around the room. Daniel sat upright. Marissa held her husband's hand tightly. The elderly couple at the end of the street exchanged uneasy glances. They were not angry. They were disappointed. Disappointed that trust had been used as a tool. I stood again, but this time, not to present more data. I closed my laptop. "I am not asking for anyone to be punished," I said. "I am only asking that the system be operated the way it was advertised. If we cannot guarantee that, then at the very least, we need to be honest about what is happening." I did not look at Melissa when I said that. I looked at the other residents. Because this was no longer a confrontation between her and me. It was a question of who truly represents the community. Another board member, Linda, spoke up. "I did not realize the use of other residents' codes was happening this frequently." "Frequently," Daniel repeated, his voice low but clear. "My garage opened in the middle of the night. That is not flexibility. That is risk." The atmosphere began to shift. It was no longer instinctive defense of a title. It was reflection. Melissa looked around, Perhaps for the first time, realizing she no longer controlled the rhythm of the room, she turned toward me. "You are manipulating everyone by exaggerating the risks," she said. "You are making them afraid." I shook my head slightly. "I am only presenting information. The emotions are theirs." The sentence cut cleanly through the air. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "According to our regulations, when there is suspicion of abuse of administrative authority, the board may hold a vote for temporary suspension pending an independent investigation." The word suspension echoed like a bell. Melissa let out a short laugh. "You are allowing a resident with no administrative expertise to steer this decision." For the first time that evening, I looked directly at her. "Security system administration is my full-time profession," I said calmly. "And I have presented data, not opinions." Several eyes widened. A few people whispered. They had never known exactly what I did, only that I worked with computers. The plot twist was not in the log entries. It was in the realization that the man they thought was an outsider understood the system better than anyone else in the room. The vote happened faster than I expected. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, just hands raised, one by one. 1, 2, 3. Enough. Melissa was temporarily suspended from her position as vice president, pending an independent audit. She stood still for a few seconds, as if she could not quite believe what had happened. Then she gathered her documents, her movements stiff. As she walked past me, she paused. "Do you think you have won?" I looked at her, without any sense of triumph. I did not see this as a personal victory. "I think the system has just been reset," I replied. She left without another word. When the meeting room door closed behind her, the space seemed lighter. People began speaking softly among themselves. Not about me, not about her, but about what should be done next to ensure this would not happen again. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. I looked around the room, where the white lights still shone evenly, where ordinary people had just made a decision that was not easy. I did not feel like I had brought anyone down. I felt something much simpler. When truth is spoken clearly and steadily, it does not need to shout to be heard. And sometimes, real power does not sit at the head of the table. It belongs to the one who stands up while the rest of the room is still hesitating. 4 months after the vote, the house on the hill went up for sale, and Melissa was no longer the one opening the gate on weekend nights. I looked at the sign one breezy afternoon. Desert sunlight washed over the terracotta roof tiles and the stone walls that used to glow whenever there was a party. The house was still beautiful, just quieter. No music. No line of cars stretching toward the entrance. The independent audit was completed after 6 weeks. The report was long, detailed, clinical. The gate system had serious vulnerabilities in the way temporary codes were issued. Internal oversight procedures lacked transparency. Several meeting minutes had been edited without a formal vote. No one explicitly called it personal abuse of authority, but everyone understood. Melissa resigned before the board could hold an official removal vote. She sent a final email in a formal tone, saying she wanted to spend more time with her family. No mention of the data. No mention of the nights when residents' codes were rotated like master keys. The community did not react loudly. No applause. No celebration. Just a collective exhale. The gate system was upgraded. Every personal code now required 2-factor authentication by default. All temporary codes were displayed openly on the dashboard for residents to review. Meeting minutes were stored with uneditable electronic signatures, the way it should have been from the beginning. One evening, Daniel stood in front of his garage, looking at the closed door under the yellow porch light. He turned to me. "I do not jump every time I hear a noise at midnight anymore," he said. Marissa stepped out of the house, smiling softly. Their son ran in circles across the front yard, his laughter carrying through the cool air. In that moment, I understood that the change was not only in the system, it was in the way people looked at one another. I returned to my familiar routine, working remotely, morning walks, drinking coffee alone on my porch. No more warning emails. No more tense phone calls. Just quiet. A few people in the neighborhood now knew what I actually did for a living. They asked for my advice when technical issues came up. They no longer saw me as the quiet neighbor who simply sat behind a screen. But I did not need them to change their perception. I only needed them to understand that silence does not mean weakness. Some people do not talk much. They do not argue loudly. They do not try to control others in the name of the community. They wait for the right moment. And when that moment comes, they act. That night, I sat on my porch and looked toward the neighborhood gate. The camera detected motion as a car approached. The system sent an authentication notification. The homeowner across the street pressed approve on his phone. The gate opened and closed smoothly. No abuse. No secrets. Just a transparent process. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind move through the low trees. In the soft glow of dusk, everything looked so normal that it was hard to believe a few months earlier this place had been stretched tight with tension. I did not bring anyone down. I did not seek a title. I simply reset the boundary. If you have ever lived in a community where power was used as personal privilege, you understand that feeling. The feeling of being told you are overreacting, of being asked to stay quiet to keep the peace, of being treated as if you do not know enough to ask questions. But the truth does not need to be loud. It only needs to be spoken at the right time. If this story reminds you of a moment when you had to stand up to protect your own space, share that experience. Every community has stories like this, and not everyone dares to tell them. And if you want to hear more stories where calm defeats noisy authority, where the person underestimated turns out to understand the system better than anyone else, stay with me. Because sometimes, the quietest neighbor is the one you should never underestimate.